Aloha mai kākou, and welcome to Understanding West Maui. My name is Alakai Lastimado, and today we have with us author and movie producer Lance Collins. Aloha, Lance.
Aloha.
Welcome.
Thank you.
First, let's just talk about what inspired you to explore the intersection of land colonialism and tourism in your writings on Wahikuli, affordable housing, and the land court system.
So the first chapter that I wrote was about Wahikuli, and that was in Tourism Impacts West Maui. And what I was interested in trying to identify and describe was this process where Hawaiian lands are basically erased. Like, how does that actually happen? And so I was very, very interested in, at least from what I was able to write, how did that mechanism work operating at Wahikuli? Because as many people know, the lands at Wahikuli, the Hawaiians challenged the state of Hawaii trying to alienate Wahikuli lands. And so that went all the way up to the US Supreme Court. I mean, it was a big deal. And the big deal about that case, at least at the Hawaii level, was that the Hawaii Supreme Court said that Crown lands could not be alienated unless the status and the claims of the Hawaiian people are resolved. And so what had been the problem up until that point in the courts is that the courts had invoked the political question doctrine so that Hawaiians didn't have access to the courts to address questions related to government lands and Crown lands. But the Oha versus Hawaii case, or became Hawaii versus Oha case, that the Hawaii Supreme Court said courts cannot address that, but they can issue injunctions preventing the transfer of land out of the Crown and government land trust. So anyway, so this first chapter that I wrote was to trying to explore that. And when I did that, Sharon Matten, who is the founder and president of the West Maui Preservation Association, she's like, this is very, very fascinating. Now you need to write about affordable housing, because while Hawaiians' land are being stolen from them, they also have nowhere to actually live. So I was like, oh, okay, that's actually a good point. Like, why haven't I? So, I mean, Wahikuli does address in a sort of indirect or oblique way affordable housing, because eventually those disputed lands were transferred to DHHL, and now there are Hawaiian homeland subdivisions that have been built, at least on part of the lands in Wahikuli. But the lands to the south of Wahikuli were, both after the war, like an original affordable housing project when the territory and then the state, the way that they envisioned affordable housing 80 years ago was to basically just chop up land and auction it off. And then in the late 60s, Elmer Cavalli, who was the mayor of Maui, they got Hale Mahaolu involved, and they used all of these government subsidies and loans and tax credits and all this sort of stuff, and then they built worker housing to the south of what were the original Wahikuli lots. And so there is an intersection between the loss of Crown lands and affordable housing, because what was happening at Wahikuli was, piece by piece, the Crown lands in small fragments, lot by lot, were being removed from the Crown Land Trust. So that sort of tied into the second chapter, which was in social change in West Maui. And the question there was, do we actually have an affordable housing crisis? And I mean, the name of the chapter probably sums up my view of it, which is fast tracking the luxury housing crisis. And my point, at least that I uncovered by researching, is that the issues that we have about the working people having a decent place to live in Hawaii, it's not a crisis if a crisis is considered to be a temporary problem that occurs unexpectedly. Hawaii, during the plantation period, used the lack of housing as a way to control workers. And so when we transitioned from agriculture into tourism, that mechanism never changed. And so one of the ways that the resorts and all of the sort of secondary industries around tourism are able to try to control labor is to not have enough worker housing. And so it's not a crisis if it's been going on for 100 years. one of the consequences of that is because we're constantly told, oh, well, government regulation is what's driving up the cost of housing. That's the problem. But actually, we had an affordable housing problem before there were any government regulations. So that can't be true. And then we also know it's not true because there are special laws, the fast track procedures, that allow government regulations to be suspended. And so if they can be suspended, then we do have a law that should work, that if that was a problem for affordable housing, but it's not. And so what I've discovered in this chapter with affordable housing is that what happens is what you can do what they call affordable housing project that's just 51% affordable housing, and the other 49% is market rate. So it's really actually not an affordable housing project, that's a partly affordable housing project. But what I discovered is any of the projects in West Maui that were 100% affordable, after 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, most of them remained owner-occupant houses. But if a project was half affordable and half market, within 10 years, nobody was an owner-occupant in any of those subdivisions. And so my conclusion is that, first of all, government regulation is not a primary problem in terms of housing affordability in Hawaii. And this fast track statute to allow affordable housing projects to go through basically worsen the problem if it isn't 100% affordable. Because what ends up happening is that they all turn into market rate housing within a decade. And that just exacerbates the problem of workers being able to access affordable housing.
So how do the histories of West Maui land and of housing policies collectively challenge the mainstream narratives about Hawaii's transition to becoming a U.S. state?
It's a tough question. So, I would say in the latest chapter that I've written, which is the historical investigations in West Maui, it's about the land court system. I compare the first and last land court applications to be filed for West Maui lands. And the first application had to do with an area of land down by the harbor called Pelikane. And what we find is that there's a dispute over lands that were given at the Mahele. And some of the land was being controlled by Bishop Estate. Some of it was being controlled by the US government. Some of it was being controlled by the territory, and some of it was being controlled by Pioneer Mill. And the territory went through the land court registration process and basically said, no, we own everything because this is actually all government land. And Victoria Kamamalu didn't get any of it. Like where the boundary is, her land is actually like to the north. And so this should all be government land. But Pioneer Mill was not happy with that, and neither was Bishop Estate, who at the time the trustees were all sugarmen. They all were part of, captains of industry and stuff. And so in many ways, during the plantation period, these sugarmen basically used their control of Bishop Estate for the ends of the plantation system. And so what ended up happening was the Hawaii Supreme Court dinged the government and said, the territory, and said, no, actually, what you did is wrong. We're going to send this case back to the trial court. And what it showed was that even though the U.S. had established the civilian government, the territory of Hawaii, the shots were still being called by the sugarmen. And then at the end of the territorial period, when the last land court application was filed, that was the land court application for Ka'anapali. The Ka'anapali resort is that mostly actually in the Lahaina moku, but the southern portion of Honoko'ai, which was part of this huge application for lands. And in that case, in the land court system, there's an abstractor of title, and they go through and they research all the land titles to figure out who has what claims. And this is just it's a neutral government official, but this is during the territorial period. And the abstractor reported back to the court and said, it's very likely that Pioneer Mill doesn't have a claim to any of these lands, but particularly like this parcel, and this parcel, they have absolutely no claim. And it's questionable about whether they actually got interests in any of these other lands. And what was the result of that case? The result of that case was they published something in the newspaper and then Pioneer Mo got the whole thing. And so I think what that demonstrates to us in some ways is that the land court process in particular was this mechanism for the sugar interests, big business interests, to use government to its ends. But it has another side to it, because actually in all of the places where the land court system wasn't implemented, there still is the ability to resist, at least within that framework, there is still the ability to resist these claims to Hawaiian lands by the sugar interests and the big businesses.
Now, if you could implement one policy change to address housing inequity in West Maui, what would it be?
Oh, shucks. So I would say, this is based on the research mostly from the Wahikuli chapter, but also in the affordable housing chapter. So Elmer Carvalho, other than the fact that it was Crown lands, the Wahikuli Terrace project was actually, it was a brilliant way of using tax credits and low interest loans and that sort of stuff to be able to create worker housing. The problem with it was that it was built on Crown lands. But in Kahului, Elmer Carvalho was responsible, before he stopped being mayor, for Luana Gardens. And that, I think, is what needs to happen is the county, possibly the state, but primarily the county, needs to get back in the business of developing worker housing, because if the private developers are more interested in the windfall profits of luxury development, that's where the government needs to step in and say, there's market failure here, we need to provide housing for our people. And Luana Gardens is a great way of doing it, because they can use low interest loans or no interest loans, they used government subsidies, and then for many of them were rentals, and so then people were able to use Section 8 vouchers to pay their rent, and then it would go to the county so that it could go into their affordable housing fund. And so it was like this really great way of like self-funding additional projects. And I think the county needs to look more in that direction than to rely on the private market to build housing, because it's not working. We're going to continue to have this struggle. People are going to continue to move away. There's more Hawaiians that live outside of Hawaii now than in Hawaii, and it's all part of this process of basically erasing Hawaiians from Hawaiian lands. So,
Okay, so now I want to switch over to the Torrens system. What is the Torrens system, and why was it introduced in Hawaii and in the Philippines in 1903?
Okay, so the Torrens system is also known as land court. So the Torrens system was a way of controlling land that was developed in Australia in the middle of the 19th century. So what was happening there was in New South Wales, which was the only area of Australia that wasn't a convict colony. They had a whole bunch of people that moved in. And what was going on is the people who were already there, they were scammers, and they were basically like, everybody had stolen the land from the Aborigines, so then they were basically like, oh, well, I own this, and then they're like signing a deed over, and then somebody would build a house, and it turns out, no, actually, I don't own this land. And there was like rife with fraud and people, being cheated, and this is between settlers. I'm not talking about like the settlers cheating the Aborigines. So the result was that this guy said, well, why don't we treat land the way that we treat ships? And his name was Torrens. He was from Ireland. He goes, and he was in their legislature or whatever. And he goes, why don't we treat land the way we treat ships? Like, the only way that you can transfer ownership of a ship is if you register it. The same way that today, like cars, right? Like, if you take someone's car, you can't be the owner of it unless you notify, the county. So it's basically a similar system. He said, why don't we apply this to land? And once it's in this system, if somebody is somehow defrauded or something, don't be able to know, because it's all in this register. And if there is a problem, we'll be able to fix it and all this stuff. Well, it was a great idea for Australia, for settler Australia, because then it became a way for people to feel secure in these land titles from the land that they had taken from the native people. And then the British applied this all over the British Empire. So in Palestine, in Ireland, in Fiji, in Malaysia, everywhere there's British, Palestine, there are parts of Israel today that are actually still under the British land court system. It's fascinating. Anyways, So at the end of the 19th century, it was like, oh, this is this very progressive way of controlling land. It's very efficient. You don't have to worry about people scamming or stealing. And so then Americans started trying to like use it. And so several states adopted it. And one of the things that they were all part of the Republican Party. They had all gone to Ivy League schools. The folks that basically took control of government in Hawaii at the beginning of the 20th century, they were the same people that were at the head of the civilian government in the Philippines. And so in 1903, it just happened that it happened at the same time. It wasn't like there was a plan. They both adopted the land court system, the Torrens system. And in Hawaii, it was voluntary. And in the Philippines, it was mandatory. And very funny, where it was mandatory, it was a total failure for 100 years. And in Hawaii, where it was voluntary, it was successful anywhere where banks or industry needed to be certain that like no Hawaiian could challenge. And so everywhere like Makena Resort, Ka'anapali Resort, in Oahu, you have like basically anywhere there's a condo that's pretty much registered in land court because the banks wanted security that no Hawaiian would be able to raise their land rights later. In the Philippines, nobody did it unless it was a big development because you had to survey. In order to get into land court, you have to survey the land. And in the Philippines, most people couldn't do that. So unless there was like some big development. So it was a failure up until very recently.
Okay, and so now how did the Torrens system differ from traditional land systems in Hawaii and the Philippines? And maybe how did the colonialism shape its implementation?
Okay, easy questions. Definitely the idea that individuals own land. I mean, that's one thing that's is different is the difference between the private ownership of land and the communal usufruct forms of or more negotiated systems of control of land, and that's both true in Hawaii and in the Philippines. And so the land court system and even the American system of land titling was this different way of doing it. And Kauikeauli, when he transitioned to what I would say is like a full private ownership of property system, I mean, the idea of doing that was to minimize what was going on throughout the Pacific. The Spanish did the Marquesas, the French did Tahiti, and then the Leeward Islands. And Kauikeauli, there was several things that he was doing, and the Mahele was one of the ways to limit the possibility that there would be like this just one fell swoop foreign control over all land in Hawaii. And so, it had that purpose and it, had that thing. The problem was after the Treaty of Reciprocity, when American capital, flooded into Hawaii, it ended up basically being taken in the opposite direction. The Chinese have this really great saying. It's like, the careful man will chain his treasure box to protect it, and the thief will come in the night and find it a helpful way to load the box onto his back and take it out of the house. And I think in some ways the Mahele ended up doing that, but it wasn't something in the 1840s that you would know. It's something that, was not something that was totally expected. And so when American capital came into Hawaii at the vast scale that it did after the Treaty of Reciprocity, then the private ownership of land ended up being a way where the people who had way more money were able to take it from the people who had less. And so that's also something that happened in the Philippines in a slightly different way. But the shift from the communal usufruct to private ownership is sort of part of this larger general economic trend of moving towards a market-based system. And in a market-based system, the people who have all of the money get to control how the system works.
So why do you think that the system failed to gain widespread use in the Philippines for over a century, but it was more, adopted easily in Hawaii?
Yeah. I was trying to skip over that, but yeah. So in the Philippines, you have to survey the land, and so the costs of that for a farmer are very, very expensive. And most people were like, well, like, why do it? It doesn't really matter. Like, I'll continue using my land. So why does it matter, if I have it? So it was a failure in that sense. And then, there were all of these like parallel shadow systems going on. And then who was the owner of land, or who got to have the final say for most parts of the Philippines for the 100 years after they adopted it, was whoever was in the tax record, the property tax record. So that was totally fine, and that's just, everybody just sort of learned to figure it out in that sort of way. In Hawaii, the Philippines doesn't have the issues of settler colonialism the way that Hawaii does, where you have this process of basically removing the native people and erasing the native people from the land, whereas that was going on here. And so the land court system was very useful, as I mentioned, in a different way, because it completely erases all claims to land. And so where, the land court system operates where there's resorts, where there's condos, anytime there's major financing of land, you'll find the land court system. And there's a lot of that in Hawaii where people live. And so it was very successful here, even though it was a voluntary basis, whereas in the Philippines, it was not successful because basically nobody cared and it didn't impact most people's lives.
So how relevant do you think the Torrens system is today? And do you see it continuing to play a role in land ownership in Hawaii and in the Philippines?
So one of the problems with the land court system, one of the problems that the land court system was trying to solve was this idea of like, well, how do we prevent Hawaiians from asserting land claims later? So you do the land court, and then after a year, once the proceeding is done, it doesn't matter if they were wrong. The only solution that you have if land court land was registered incorrectly is you can make a claim to the state and get paid, but you can never get the land back. But that's no longer a problem in the non-land court processes because we have this thing called title insurance. And if you have a mortgage, that's one of the things you have to do when you buy your house is you have to get title insurance. And so the thing that the land court system tried to solve no longer is an issue because title insurance is really cheap. And so actually we have lots of condos, particularly in Honolulu, that are trying to get deregistered from land court because it's actually more economically inefficient for things to go through the land court than it is to just get title insurance. And so now they passed a law about 10 years ago that allowed for a process for properties to be deregistered from land court. So, I think that's like the pinnacle of this problem or phenomenon of settler colonialism. It's like, okay, well, now that we've erased all Hawaiian claims to these in our system, we've completely erased and foreclosed any possibility of Hawaiian claims to this land. Now we're going to take it out of the system because it's cheaper to do it some other way. And so I do think that the land court system is an example of these mechanisms of settler colonialism that basically, use these logical systems to basically erase in what appears to be a legitimate way of Hawaiian claims, even though if you actually look at it from the beginning, it's not legitimate at all.
So now, how has the commodification of housing shaped affordability issues in Hawaii, and what role has tourism and second home ownership played in this dynamic?
Okay, so I think people think like, oh, we don't have enough, housing for workers, like as a general thing that there's not enough of a supply. But see, that's only true if you only look at a certain segment of the entire inventory of residential units. So like, okay, people usually don't consider hotel rooms as, a unit of residential housing, but it is. And, people, I think, understand this most when you talk about like Airbnbs and neighborhoods where they're not permitted and stuff. And then people are like, oh, really, Mo, you're taking our thing. But if you actually look at what is the affordable, what are the available residential units in a given area total, you should also include the hotel units and the luxury condo resort units and stuff, because what ends up happening is that it's that part of the housing market that ends up swallowing and creating one of the problems of affordable housing. Because under the classical view of the economics of housing is that if you build more luxury housing, then the used luxury housing goes down to the next tier of people in the market. And then the people who basically everybody can move up. If you basically open up the top, then everybody gets to move up the pyramid. Supposedly, that's what it is. The problem, even if that's true, and I question whether it is, but let's accept that as true because it's like, economic, traditional beliefs. If you accept that as true, the problem we have in Hawaii is that the luxury housing development is not being built for local people. It's built for the second home market or the global investment market. And so what happens is the more you build in that segment, it just creates more of a need for workers without actually lifting everybody up through the so-called pyramid. And so that's one of the huge problems that we have with the commodification of residential housing in Hawaii in general, not just the, ranch style tract homes in suburbia, but also condos that are part of resorts and all that sort of stuff. Is that, one of the issues in the broader economic thing is, Hawaii never went through an industrialization period. So what does that mean? So we sort of skipped that, and while the rest of the U.S. was eventually going into like a de-industrial thing, Hawaii, as the satellite of the United States, didn't have an industrial base. There was nothing here, very little that could actually create, industry. So we slipped into tourism. And so we skipped the industrialization, deindustrialization part that, the United States went through, and we went directly to the next thing, which is a sort of modern feudalistic way of you have the people who own, the land and basically earn rents from it or get rents from it. And then you have all the people that work for the landlords. Well, that's what's now happening in the rest of, in the United States and in the rest of the world. It's like this techno-feudalism of the cloud capitalist, I think somebody calls them, and this sort of thing. And we had a 40-year start on it. So, and what does that mean for affordability? Well, it just means that all of the stuff that's being built, if it's not specifically being built for workers and for, regular people, it's basically being built for, our overlords. And the more you build for the overlords, it's just going to bring more overlords. It's not going to trickle down to anybody because that's not how this market is structured.
All right, and what historical patterns in land use and housing policy have contributed to today's affordability crisis in West Maui?
So, I would say, in addition to what I just said about, building primarily for the luxury housing market as a big problem, and I think the other problem is this, what I would say is it's not fake, but it's sort of this disingenuous thing, particularly with the fast track housing projects, where it's like, okay, well, we'll build 51% of them are affordable and 49% are market. And so, somehow that's going to increase the supply of worker housing. But what it really does is it just gives whoever wins those lotteries, right? Because they have lotteries for these very limited affordable. It's basically a lottery. Somebody gets it and then they flip it and they make a bunch of money and then they move back to Kahului or whatever. And I don't blame any local person for doing that. Why wouldn't you do that, right? Like, it's hard to live here. So why wouldn't you do that if you win the lottery and have that opportunity? But in the broader system perspective of it, the problem is that the developer is long gone, and then you have less and less affordable housing, and you have all of these people that need additional services and workers for the service industries that we have. And so some of these proposals that are supposedly trying to help affordability actually have the opposite consequence, which is it actually worsens the lack of affordable housing.
All right, Lance. Now, if there's one takeaway that you would want the readers to remember from your writings on the land, colonialism, and housing in Hawaii, what would it be?
I think maybe the biggest takeaway for people to understand is that, this is Hawaii, and Hawaiians have, in both on a national level and also on a family level and an individual level, have long-standing genealogical relationship to the various land, and that it doesn't matter what legal system you create, it doesn't matter what kinds of explanations that you try to tell about Hawaii, that you can't erase that. And when you try to do that, what you are doing is it's basically a form of cultural genocide. And so to understand that trying to explain away the Hawaiians out of Hawaii doesn't actually erase them. It just is this process of trying to erase them and to be cognizant of that fact. So I would say that probably would be the biggest takeaway from these chapters.
Well, Lance, we'd like mahalo for being here.
And mahalo.
Of course. And mahalo, aloha, ahuiho.
Me kananiku kila kila o Lahaina lo na